Okay, we're recording. Okay, so this is lesson 2 of Unit 5, and it's on in organisms inheriting traits from their parents. This is actually pretty cool. I think the first time I learned about this was long ago. You'd learn about this in high school. Is really the first time I remember learning about this. So it's cool that we're learning about it already. Um, so at the beginning, this talks about how did these kittens get their fur colors, and so um, obviously they're all these, or it tells us here that these are all related kittens. They all have the same exact two parents, but they all look different. So, knowing the kitten's fur color, what would you predict the parents' fur looks like? And one thing I said was, it seems like their parents probably, maybe one of them is a gray color, maybe one of them is like this orangish red color. These ones have stripes. This one kind of has a little bit of that. This one doesn't look stripy at all. So maybe one of them has stripes, and it looks like maybe it's just the light, but we've got like these greenish eyes in these two, and more blue eyes in these. So maybe those are different traits that they have. And why do they look similar in some ways and different than others? And that's what we are talking about. So for a long time, people thought that just, people got together and their genes were just, well, they didn't know what genes were, but they just thought, like, well, obviously people's offspring looks like them. Things must just get mixed up, and it happens. But why people looked similar to their parents was kind of a mystery, and that's what this lesson is about. And it's because, to answer this question, why do they look similar in some ways and different than other ways? It's because parents, and when I say parents, I mean like uh, the parents of either like animals or the parents of, even in plants, like the parent generation of plants. Um, they have particular traits that they pass on through their genetics, but they don't pass them on evenly. That's what we're talking about. So, oh, please load. Let's zoom out and see if that helps. So I'm offline. I'll try and get back on real quick. I need that. Get out of here. All right. Anyway, see if it'll save. Okay, so first of all, this page right here, this is the page that has, let me open this up just so I can open it up right here. Go back and forth between the two, and you can see my answers. Oh, no. Okay, it's not saved, but okay, here we go. So this says, let me zoom in correctly so it's all right. So we got here is, it says, what are some differences you notice in the pea plants? And in these pea plants, we had they talk about them having traits, and the traits are, an example of traits are different colors. Another trait might be like the length of the plant or the shape of the leaves, something like that. It says, what differences do you notice in these pea plants? It's kind of hard to tell from this picture any other differences aside from the one that they want you to notice, and that you got purple and white ones. And it also says, I see bleh, in here I said the peas are either green or yellow, and that's because if you're reading this, I'm not reading it all because that would take forever as I explain all of these things, but it also tells you somewhere here the color of a pea could be green or yellow. So we can't see that in here, but it tells us that right up here. So I wrote that as well. So now it talks about Mendel and his pea plant investigation. And so what he did is he took, and this is kind of what these are all built off of, so this might not make total sense at first, and we're going to just keep talking about it. But what he did was he took two plants that he called the parent generation. And normally these plants, these pea plants, they self-fertile or self-pollinate themselves. And what that means is They reproduce in a way that the pollen, right, is how they reproduce, and the pollen gets spread around themselves, so they don't need another flower to reproduce. They're pollinating themselves, and that's how they are reproducing. We kind of talk more about that later, so I'm not using fancy science words for that right now. They just reproduce themselves normally. Now, what he did was he got a cotton swab or something, and he would collect pollen from one of the plants, like the white ones, and he would pollinate the purple ones with the pollen from the white pea plant, or vice versa. So he would cross-pollinate these two plants that normally which wouldn't normally be happening unless they were close to one another. And what he found was the plants that came from that, after that, the next generation of plants, they were all purple. All right. And then he did the same thing. And after that, but he did the same thing with these plants. Then he took the second generation of plants and he used those plants to pollinate one another. And after he pollinated these plants with one another, the second generation with one another, he got a third generation. And the third generation he found would have mostly purple flowers, but there would also be white ones. So it looks like he started with these white ones at the very first parent generation, and at first they all ended up purple, and so it looked like the white was gone, but then the white showed up later. So what is up with this? So this question says, how does the presence of white flowers change from the parent generation to the first offspring to the second? And I just said that. So there's one in the first, and then they disappear, and then in the second generation of offspring, they show up again. And so this talks about how I said some of those things in here, and this talks about kind of what he did, right, in his experiment. And then this talks about one of the main things we're discussing is dominant and recessive traits. And so he found that I'll just read the beginning. When Mendel crossed the purple flowered plant and the white flowered plants, all first generation plants had purple flowers. He called this the dominant trait. So going up here, he crossed these with one another and they all were purple. And so he found that this trait, he called this dominant, right? And then there was the because the white flower seemed to recede or fade away, he called it the recessive trait. And so the white color was the recessive trait, meaning it seems to go away at first, or it doesn't happen as strongly, or I guess. And he did this with other things like the pea colors and stuff, and he always found that there's a dominant and a recessive trait. Okay, so then it says, what could explain the mysterious disappearance and reappearance of the recessive traits? So he hypothesized that each plant must have two inherited factors for each trait, one for each parent. Some traits, such as white color flower, only occurred if a plant received two factors with white. A plant with one white flower and one purple flower would have the dominant, purple. But it could still pass on the white. This is really confusing, and there's a diagram later, so if it doesn't... if you don't totally get what this is talking about, I'll explain that more. But this question says, explain more how his data supported his hypothesis. So even if you don't really understand this hypothesis, right, what his hypothesis is saying here is that you have dominant traits like the purple and recessive traits that are white, and they will typically pass on the dominant trait, but even if you don't see the trait, like the recessive trait, the white trait in offspring, like these ones right here, it still exists in the plant somewhere because it can get passed on later on. That's what his hypothesis was. And so I kind of talked about that describing the table, how you can see how they disappear, but then they show up again later. So it seems like somehow this gene for the white has to get passed down, even though you can't see it. And so then it says, Mendel crossed a true breeding plant with yellow peas and a true breeding plant with green peas. True breeding is described somewhere up here. Oh, right here. A true breeding plant is one that will always produce offspring with a certain trait when allowed to self-pollinate. So that was these. How if these self-pollinated, these would always be purple and these would always be white. That's what true breeding means. So it says all first generation offspring has yellow peas. So this is describing the same thing. So we had yellow peas and green peas, and the first generation has all yellow. And then which trait is recessive? So in this one, right, you see the first generation was all purple. That means that the purple was the dominant one. So in this example, right, he had yellow and green peas, and the first generation was yellow, meaning so that the yellow, like the purple, yellow peas, like the purple flowers, are dominant, which means that the green peas are recessive. Okay, explanation 2. So let me see if this is loaded again. Sorry, this page is janky. Here we go. Okay. How is DNA similar? This talks about DNA. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay. And it is essentially the fingerprint or the building blocks of all living things: plant, animal, bacteria, anything. Virus. Okay. So how is DNA similar to a recipe? Well, a recipe with food, right, is all of the ingredients, all of the instructions, and how to make some type of food. And so DNA is kind of the same because DNA has all of the ingredients and the instructions in our genetics about how something, an organism, should be growing and reproducing. And if you change a recipe, you're going to change the food you're making, or it just won't work at all. And if you change DNA of an organism, it will either not work or it will grow and develop differently. Okay, and so then this talks in here, this kind of starts explaining what all of this Mendel stuff was all about. So we got chromosomes, genes, alleles, and proteins. Okay, so this says DNA is organized into structures called chromosomes. Okay, and a gene is a pair. A gene is a segment of the DNA that makes up a chromosome. And then we have different genes forms are called alleles. So alleles are like a small part of the gene, and they carry these proteins, and the proteins are these little building blocks kind of that tell you what the allele is. So now this goes into, see, this says Mendel's, this will make more sense as I go through diagrams. So if you're thinking I still don't get this, then don't worry. So Mendel's pea plant traits were controlled by just 2 alleles, a dominant one and a recessive one. So refers back to these alleles are these things that are getting passed on. So this talks about the structure of DNA, and we are going to skip this, making this model, but a lot of these vocabulary words up here you can see right here. So right here is a little diagram, and first of all we have cells, right? We learned about cells earlier, and one of the things in cells is the nucleus, and inside the nucleus is where our DNA is found. A lot of times DNA in, remember there are eukaryotic cells and there's other kinds of cells, and other kinds of cells, a lot of times the DNA and stuff is just floating around. It's not in the nucleus, but it is in ours. And then so this says during an early stage of cell division, DNA is organized into structures called chromosomes. So there's like various chromosomes, and the DNA is these molecules that contain information. And these are essentially different proteins that are all just wrapped up in a spiral shape. And there are, I'm not going to go into how that works more. Okay, so then there is this model, and you're free to do this yourself, this actually might make a little bit more sense. But in the weekly plan, I also put a link to this How Mendel's pea plants helped us understand genetics. You can look up this video right here. It's a TED Ed talk. It's only 3 minutes long. And that kind of gets at the gist of what this is trying to show you. And it says, think about the different phenotypes of fish scale color in this lab. So this was supposed to be pretending you had different fish colors using these little beads. And the phenotypes of fur color. So phenotypes, right, is when you have a particular allele or a type of a gene. A phenotype is the way, just a fancy word. Whenever it says it up here. There we go. The observable traits of an organism is its phenotype. So a phenotype could be like blonde hair versus brown hair, or blue eyes versus brown eyes, something like that. Those are the scientific term is they're different phenotypes. So explain why all kittens don't have the same fur color, even though they have the same parents. So if you watch this video or you do this, you will see that the genes, the alleles, are not getting passed down equally, and they also get passed down randomly depending on what genes the parents have in the first place. And I will show you more of that in Exploration 3, but you can kind of watch that video and get the gist, or just do the lab. Now this talks about predict effects of mutations. Changes in a section of DNA are known as mutations. So sometimes a mutation, this talks about how sometimes random mutations can happen because DNA is constantly getting copied in a cell. There are parts of cells that are constantly copying your DNA, which is, in a computer, these are billions and billions of lines of information. And there's genes and proteins and stuff inside your cells that are copying all of this and making a whole new separate copy before the cell splits off into two. And so it's duplicating itself. So occasionally it doesn't copy something 100% correctly, and that's what we call as a mutation. And so mutations can be harmful, neutral, or beneficial. And so it talks about 3 examples here, and it talks about bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. And so they're like, right now there's lots of bacteria that are immune to some of the most basic antibiotics that we use. Like if you get strep throat, sometimes you might have to go back and get a different antibiotic because the bacteria has a mutation that allows it to not be killed off by that antibiotic. So that would be the beneficial one because it's beneficial for the bacteria because the bacteria can live. Galactosemia in humans is a mutation that prevents people from digesting sugar. That's a harmful mutation because that means that it would not be good for people's health if they can't digest sugar. And then mutations like eye color and hair color don't really affect people positive and negatively. So usually those would be considered to be neutral. All right. And this is, I think, is where a lot of it kind of comes together and makes more sense. So if you've kind of been confused, I think this exploration helps bring it all together a little bit. First of all, this says there is this process below that allows a horticulturalist to grow only purple flowered pea plants for many generations, but they're constrained by time. And so which one of these would be good? Things below, these will all work down below, but which one will be the best for the time? Sorry, okay. So this first one says a horticulturist could start by crossing 2 plants with purple flowers, and in each new generation they're going to select them. This would work. The problem is that this whole process that they should select plants with purple flowers. So they're going to have a bunch of flowers, but then they're going to have to sort through them for the purple ones. That's going to take time. This one down here is really easy to eliminate because it says usually takes 1 to 2 weeks. And then this last one says a horticulturalist could allow the purple plants to self-pollinate, then separate purple plants from the first generation and allow those to self-pollinate. So this one seems similar to this one at first, but this one has start by crossing two plants, selecting them with purple, and you have to do it until all of them have purple flowers. This one, you're starting with only purple plants. They're self-pollinating, and you are only picking out purple ones from there. So this one would be like the least amount of work and the least amount of time. Now this one talks about, so here, this diagram right here talks more about the alleles and genes and chromosomes. So each one of these is a chromosome, right? So this is a pair of chromosomes. And now when parents have offspring, they pass on each set of a chromosome. So a lot of times you can see how there's multiple chromosomes that parents will pass on. And so this would be like, this would be like parent 1, and this might be parent 2, right? And so an organism has both of these chromosomes in their DNA, right? And they got one of them from one parent and one of them from another parent. So this says that a gene occupies a specific location on a chromosome. So this pair, this green color, this is considered to be a gene, and the alleles are different forms of that gene. So in this case, this gene has 2 of these lowercase d, and they just use letters to differentiate these things. But this is a gene, well, let's call it the green gene, and it has 2 lowercase d alleles. This is the brown gene, and this has 1 lowercase g and an uppercase g. And these are the same gene, right? But they use uppercase and lowercase because they're a little bit different forms of the gene. And this is actually what recessive genes and dominant genes are. So you can see how throughout this whole thing there's uppercase letters and lowercase letters, and we use uppercase for the dominant genes and lowercase for the recessive genes. So going down here, this talks about the very first example of the pea plants, right? With the yellow, and it's using yellow pods and green pods. So it says the allele for the yellow pod is Y. The allele for the green pod is a lowercase y. Sorry, uppercase. Yellow is uppercase Y. Let me highlight those so it's easier to keep track of. And the green pod is lowercase y. So on the lines below, write the phenotype for each. So remember, the phenotype is like what it looks like to us. So parent 1 has 2 Y in there. So if in their chromosome, right? Remember, because their chromosomes are in pairs, right? They've got, parent 1 has 2 chromosomes. And when you look at its gene, it's got 2 uppercase Y's, which means that it's yellow. Parent 2 also has 2 genes. I mean, I guess I could draw these out. Like, imagine, so parent 1, I'll just be like, so parent 1, right? Parent 1 is like this, and then somewhere in there, right, it's got the gene Y, and it's got the gene Y. I'm not going to draw the other ones, but somewhere in those 2 chromosomes, right, it's got 2 Y's. It's like doo-doo-doo. There's one of the genes, right? So this is parent 1. Now the next parent, let me see if I could just copy this. Of course not. Okay, so anyway, then parent 2 would look just like this, but it'd have a lowercase y and a lowercase y. So both of its chromosomes have the green allele. So that this one would be green. This parent would have a green pods, because both of these are for the green color. Now the offspring have 1 uppercase y and 1 lowercase y, and so those would all be yellow. And the reason they're all yellow is because, remember, the uppercase means that it's dominant, and if you have a dominant and a recessive, they're going to have the traits or the phenotypes of the dominant color. So when you look at this one, right, there's a dominant yellow in there, and like they all have 2 chromosomes, but one of theirs is a Y and one of theirs is a lowercase y for the offspring. But because they have the uppercase Y, which is the yellow, they will have yellow pods. Okay, and that's kind of what I said right here. So we can model this with these squares. So now you can see, and then this is going to go way back to the beginning with the purple and the white plants. And we'll show you how you had a purple plant and a white plant. And remember, you had all of their offspring, right? You had, let me be fancy over here. So you had, right, you had the purple plant, and you had the white plant. You're not going to be able to see the white. But it was like purple and white. And then the next generation had it was like all purple, right? And then it was a combo of them after that. How did that happen? Well, because this is what you had. So it says that the purple plant had the dominant alleles FF, these 2 uppercases, right? So you can see how right here, the purple has only dominant genes. So it had 2 chromosomes, right? The purple plant had 2 chromosomes, and somewhere in the chromosome there was a gene, and both of the alleles are the dominant. So that's what this parent has. Now, the next parent, the white flowers, right? This also has 2 chromosomes. Sorry for my terrible drawings. And somewhere along the same place in these chromosomes, right, it has lowercase f's. It has the other version, the less dominant version of, right, where this had the 2 pairs of the dominants. This one has 2 pairs of the less dominant. So F has 1 chromosome has the recessive, and the other chromosome has the recessive. So what happens is these plants, right, they have offspring, right? So we get one of these chromosomes get passed to the offspring. So one of these would get passed on to offspring. I'll draw that over here. So you get 1 from parent 1, right? And it would have a uppercase F, right, the dominant. And then you would also pass on, the other parent would pass on one of their chromosomes. But in their chromosome, you've got a lowercase, or the recessive trait. So what do all of the offspring have? All of the offspring, and you can see that here in this table, all of the offspring have 1 dominant, or the capital F, and 1 recessive gene. Okay? And so this is why that first generation of offspring was all purple. Because if you look at them all, right, because the purple parent passed on a dominant or capital F gene to every single offspring, right? And all we're doing to get these letters is, see, this is F and lowercase f. Capital F, lowercase f is right here. Capital F, lowercase f. Capital F, lowercase f. Every single one of these offspring has 1 chromosome that has the dominant gene in it, and because it has the dominant gene, which is the purple gene, they all end up being purple. And I can talk about that here, so I'm going to skip down a little bit. And then the pea plants were determined by 1 gene. However, many traits like fur color are determined by more than 1 gene. And so what I said is, you can see that this is 1 gene, right? Because a gene is 2 sets of alleles, right? You got a gene is 2 sets of alleles from a chromosome, so that's why there's 2 and 2 here. So let's say you had a parent with 2 genes, right? So you'd have like A and A maybe, and then let's say you have like B and B, something like this. Then the other parent, right? So this is 1, so you got like, this is 1 gene, and then you'd have a second gene, right? And so if you were to make one of these little table things for these, then you'd have the other parent, and it has like C, C, D. I'm just using random letters. D. And then you'd like split it all up, right? Now that there's two genes, each one has two genes. Or I guess these should still be A's. These should be like A, because they're the same genes. A, and this would be like B and B, right? Now that they're doing the same genes, but now you've got a gajillion different possibilities, because it's not just you don't have to just figure out how the four things connect. It's like four times as many. So the more genes you have, the more complicated the possibilities end up becoming. And so this says calculate the genotype probability. So it actually gives us an example. So it says complete the Punnett square. The alleles for red feathers, R is dominant, and the allele for brown feathers, R is recessive. So this is, so the capital R is red, and this is brown. The lowercase is brown. And so you're just crossing them. So a capital R and a capital R would be two capital R's. This one was a capital R and a lowercase r. This one is a lowercase and a lowercase, right? And then this one is an uppercase and a lowercase. So then you go down here and you can fill this table out. So the RR, how many RRs are there? There is one. There's four total options, but RR is only one out of the four. So that's a 25% chance. A capital R, lowercase r is happening half the times, because there's one here. This has one capital and one lowercase, or one capital and lowercase. Remember, that has one dominant and one recessive. So that's in 2 out of the 4 total things. So that's why I wrote 1 to 2, because it was like 1 out of the 2 out of 4 is, reduces to 1 out of 2. And then RR is 1 out of the 4, the lowercase r's. Sorry, I keep saying RR. So the red feathers, right? The red feathers were the dominant gene. And so when I look at this, right, this one's going to be red because it has a dominant. This one's going to be red because it has the dominant capital. And this one is going to have red feathers because it has the dominant capital R. So 3 out of the 4 of these end up with red feathers, 75%. Brown feathers, this one is the only one with brown feathers. And it only gets brown feathers because this offspring was the offspring that received the recessive gene from this parent and the recessive gene from that parent. So it ends up with brown feathers, so 25% chance. So that is how you can figure out how genes are passed on. They use these squares a little bit, and you can kind of figure out how things are passed down. But the important takeaways, and it is kind of confusing with all these tables and everything, but the important thing to remember is that things are essentially getting passed down in chromosomes. So you and every other living thing has genes, right, that are passed off of. There's chromosomes, which is just a section of DNA. It's a portion of your DNA, and the two matching alleles are a gene, and depending on what those two alleles are, right, in this gene would tell you as a person what you would end up getting. So if this was your chromosome, right, for this whatever this gene is right here, this green gene, you would end up with the recessive trait, because see, it says these are lowercase, so you got past the 2 recessive traits for this. With this brown one, right, this whole gene right here, you'd get the whatever the dominant gene is, because you have one of those dominants, right? For this gene, you would have the dominant gene because they're both dominant. For this one, you would have the dominant gene because there is a dominant one. The only other, I think this one right here, this one is the only one where you'd actually get the recessive gene, because this is both lowercase, right? But anytime you have a combo or both dominant, they're both dominant. So Yeah, that is how genes get passed on.